Chapter 23 is looking at the Cold War. And even though Chapter 23 really only covers the early days of it, it's important to understand that the Cold War is a long conflict. It lasts from about 1947 to 1991. It's a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that is going to last most of the 20th century. But the early intense days of the Cold War is really what this chapter is focusing on. Now, the Cold War is obviously characterized by a lack of direct fighting between the two adversaries or between these two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Now, there was some direct fighting. There were Soviets allegedly in Chinese uniforms during the Korean War, other cases where US spy planes are forced down. But both sides tried to keep direct confrontations secret because the costs of a direct engagement would have been far too high, including the use of atomic and later nuclear weapons. There is a lot of indirect conflict, though, and many U.S. Conflicts overseas for the remainder of the 20th century are directly tied to this overarching Cold War conflict between ourselves and the Soviet Union. The United States emerges from World War II as the world's most powerful nation, both economically and militarily. We're also the only nation that has the atomic bomb at this point, which certainly contributes to being the world's strongest nation militarily. The only nation that could really rival the United States was the Soviet Union or USSR. And after World War II, they occupied Eastern Europe and a part of Germany, even though they had promised free elections at the Yalta Conference during the war. Now, both nations envisioned a post-war world order that was modeled on their own society, and both were determined to make that happen. Their alliance broke down after World War II due to their political and economic differences, and believed in the uh, both believed in the historical inevitability of their ideology, and that only one of the ideologies could prevail. They believed that they could not coexist. Um, and differences between capitalism and communism or democracy and communism, notwithstanding, it's easier to maybe understand their disagreement by their opposing worldviews. So the United States valued individual liberty and individual freedom, even if that came ahead of the good of the group. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, valued the collective good over the individual. So, in their view, if democracy gets in the way, it can be discarded because, from their point of view, personal freedom doesn't mean anything when people are starving. Nonetheless, both sides see one another as an existential threat or a threat to their very existence. So early on in this developing conflict, both sides are developing strategies to combat the other. For the United States, this comes in the form of what's called containment. American diplomat George Kennan wrote the so-called Long Telegram in 1946 that proposed a policy of containment, saying that the United States should work to contain communist influence to where it already existed. So we're not going to try to roll back communism in, say, Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, but we don't want to allow it to spread elsewhere. This was kind of reinforced by the idea of the Iron Curtain, which was this border between a mostly free West and a communist East in Europe. This furthered the idea of a struggle between the two powers with very real global borders to it. So George Kennan proposes containment, but it's going to be the so-called Truman Doctrine that makes containment official U.S. policy. Named after the president who instated it, obviously, this said that the U.S. would support any nations resisting communism. And in the short term, what this meant was that the United States would secure $400 million in economic aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey, both of which were fighting more or less civil wars which threatened to lead to a communist takeover of the country. So the Truman Doctrine is a tactic to further the strategy of containment. Similarly, the Marshall Plan is a tactic that can further the strategy of containment. So, the Marshall Plan is, of course, intended to prevent the spread of communist influence to Western Europe. Keep in mind what Western Europe would, or really what Europe would have looked like in the aftermath of World War II. World War II had left Western Europe devastated and thus vulnerable to Soviet influence. I mean, communism was promising full bellies and warm stoves in the wake of World War II's devastation. So, in order to try to counter that and prop up the Western European economy so that it doesn't fall to communism, the United States, through the Marshall Plan, gives a massive economic aid package to help recovery in Western Europe and to prevent the spread of communism. At the time, it was $13 billion, but that amounts to about $135 billion today. Now, to Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, the Marshall Plan was an attempt to prop up a system of capitalism that was on the verge of collapse in Europe. So he really sees it as a kind of act of economic and psychological warfare intended to kind of lull or trick people into supporting capitalism rather than overthrowing it. So because he views the Marshall Plan this way, he orders Eastern European nations that are effectively under under Soviet control to refuse this money. And it was offered to everyone. We offered it to every European nation, including the Soviet Union. But it was denied by the Soviets and all of their satellite states in Eastern Europe. So that further solidifies Europe's division along the Iron Curtain. And it's also moving forward going to leave Eastern Europe relatively underdeveloped economically and technologically when compared to Western Europe, which is able to largely recover uh, from the aftermath of World War II because of American goods. And by the way, worth noting, it's also a good thing for us to help these nations recover economically because once they have recovered, then they are markets for American goods, and our production, or rather our industrial production, can stay high because we've got a lot of buyers who can afford to buy these things because their economies are doing better. So we help to advance the US economy, we advance containment by helping these nations effectively resist communism. This is really overall a win-win. Quickly, worth noting, we pursue a kind of similar strategy, or similar to the Marshall Plan, in Asia by helping the Japanese rebuild as a kind of bastion of democracy and anti-communism in Asia, and will help to bolster their economy for a long time, which is also going to perhaps uh, aid in the strategy of containing communism to where it already existed. Now, the Cold War will turn more militaristic in 1948 and 1949. Germany had been split into four different zones occupied by the Allies for reconstruction after World War II, one belonging to the Soviets, and then the other three belonging to the United States, France, and Britain. Now, the Allies, rather, the Soviet Union wanted to weaken Germany so that it couldn't threaten them again. Whereas the Americans, the Brits, and the French wanted to help Germany recover. That way, it didn't lead to the rise of yet another dictator. And then also for similar reasons to the Marshall Plan, we helped them recover economically, then there are markets for our goods as well. But when the U.S., so the Soviets and the other allies very much disagree on what the reconstruction of Germany should actually look like. So when the US, Britain, and France united their zone's currency as a kind of bid to begin reuniting Germany as one nation, the Soviet Union responded by cutting off access to, rather cutting off road access as well as cutting off electricity to West Berlin, which Berlin, the capital of Germany, was well within the Soviet zone, as you can see from the map, and West Berlin was overseen by Britain, France, and the United States. Basically, the United States taking charge. So, in other words, half of the capital city really is supposed to be under our protection, and they've just been cut off from electricity, and there is no access for us to get them by roads or waterways any supplies that they need to make it through the upcoming winter. So the United States responds with the Berlin airlift. It's a massive airlift of food, fuel, medicine, etc. So we fly planes over the Soviet occupied zone, daring them effectively to shoot us down so that we can drop supplies on the people of West Berlin that are supposed to be under our protection. And the Soviets aren't going to shoot down our planes because that risks war. And at this point, we're still the only nation that has the atomic bomb. This is a public relations nightmare, if you can call it that, for the Soviets. It makes the Soviets look like the bad guys here, especially when we're doing things like dropping Christmas presents on the children of West Berlin on Christmas Eve. Um, the blockade and the airlift is going to last 11 months until Stalin ultimately lifts the blockade. Um, and this was a successful and crucial test of containment, and it had worked. We had prevented at least West Berlin from falling to communism because they were starving and didn't have electricity. However, it does result in a split where Germany is going to be divided into two nations, a democratic Western German or Western, excuse me, a democratic West Germany and a communist East Germany. And that split is going to persist until the end of the 20th century. Another military or more militaristic expansion of the Cold War comes in 1949, where the Soviets successfully test their own atomic bomb about 10 years sooner than we expected them to be able to develop one on their own. The big reason for this is that they did have spies in the Manhattan Project, and we'll come back around to that later in the chapter. But in response to the Soviets becoming an atomic power, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations all form a permanent military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. And they will use this for their own mutual defense, saying that an attack on one is an attack on all. So what that means is that if the Soviet Union invades West Germany or invades France, one of our NATO allies, then we jump in to defend. Likewise, if anyone attacks us, all the other NATO members jump in to defend. And this is hoped to deter the Soviet Union from expanding militarily. Um, but the Soviet Union is going to respond years later in 1955 with its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, essentially setting up a potential conflict between any of these member states, at which point it starts to look a lot like the lead up to World War One, where everyone's kind of tied together in a complex series of alliances, and if any of those threads are pulled, the whole thing comes down. Now, NATO is an important development in American foreign policy because it marks a really dramatic departure from US traditions of isolationism and neutrality. So we've rejected firmly Washington's warnings against permanent military alliances, especially with Europe, and we've created a permanent military alliance, most of which is with Western European nations. In the 1950s, the focus of the Cold War is going to shift away from Europe and toward Asia. So, for one, China was quote unquote lost in a communist revolution in 1949. And this is a result of a civil war that had been going on really since before World War II. But when China goes communist, the United States refuses to recognize the new communist government as being legitimate, and we won't recognize them, in fact, until the 1970s. Also, because of this loss of China and millions upon millions of people to communism effectively, the United States, or rather the National Security Council for the United States, issues an important document called NSC 68. So this is National Security Council hyphen 68, so NSC 68. This was a manifesto that called for a permanent military buildup for a kind of worldwide anti-communist crusade, and it characterized the conflict as a battle for the very survival of the free world. And as a result, the American military will stay very large rather than demobilizing after World War II, which is typically the way things happen. You build up the military. Once the war is over with, you demobilize much of it. But the United States is going to keep the size of and spending for the military very high and even continues to do so today. And this can be traced back to fall of China, to communism, and NSC 68. Next, we have the Korean War. So after World War II, Korea, which had been occupied by the Japanese, will be divided into two reconstruction zones, one overseen by the United States, one overseen by the Soviets. And that resulted in a South Korea that was non-communist. It wasn't democratic, it had a dictator, but wasn't communist, so it was okay with us. And then North Korea, which had been the Soviet zone, becomes a communist nation. But in 1950, North Korea invades South Korea in an effort to unify the peninsula as one communist nation. President Truman will manage to persuade the United Nations Security Council to authorize military force to repel this invasion. And while normally the Soviet Union, another member of the Security Council, would have vetoed such a move, the Soviets were actually boycotting the Security Council at the time. Um, it They were boycotting the Security Council because they wanted the new communist Chinese delegation to be seated and recognized by the Security Council. So because they weren't there, they couldn't veto this move, and thus the United States, using about 90% of which is U.S. troops, are going to go into South Korea and try to drive the North Koreans out. That is successful, but Truman makes a fateful decision and continues past the 38th parallel, which was the dividing point between the two nations, in an effort to topple North Korea's communist government and unite the peninsula as one non-communist nation. That goes badly because as we get close to the Yalu River, which is the border with China, the Chinese are a bit nervous that we're just going to continue going and try to topple their government. And certainly some Americans are hoping that we do that. And there has been some talk among politicians and military brass about pursuing such a strategy. So as we get too close to the Yalu River for Chinese comfort, the Chinese will enter the war on the side of North Korea and drive U.S. or rather, excuse me, UN forces back to roughly the point of the 38th parallel, where the war is going to stalemate for a couple of years. Now, the commanding general, General Douglas MacArthur, called for a full-scale invasion of China and the use of atomic warfare in response to Chinese actions. Now, Truman disagreed with this, and basically refused him permission to do this. So MacArthur tries to go over the president's head by going public, and trying to drum up support there, by trying to push this with Congress. This is really insubordination. So Truman fires MacArthur and replaces him. And MacArthur was a very popular figure at the time, so this was seen as a pretty bold move by the president. Nonetheless, the war will end in a stalemate and an armistice or a ceasefire. The war is never actually officially ended, which is why we still have a lot of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea for their protection. Um, so we have a ceasefire armistice in 1953 that brings the fighting of the war at least to a close. Worth noting very quickly here, Korea is the first war in which troops fight in integrated units. Truman is going to issue an executive order to desegregate the U.S. armed forces at the end of World War II, and I think 1948 is when he does this. And this, again, will make Korea the first war fought with integrated or desegregated units. Question number two, how did the Cold War reshape ideas of American freedom? So the Cold War is an ideological conflict as well for the hearts and minds of people across the globe. Keep in mind that if we're trying to get people to choose between our system and the other system, victory is only meaningful if the world chooses it willingly rather than have it forced upon them by a war. So culture becomes a battlefield both at home and abroad. So we see things like, comic book heroes like Captain America fighting communists instead of Nazis now. Hollywood begins to produce anti-communist films like The Red Menace in 1949 and express fears of a communist takeover through sci-fi films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And both the US and the Soviet Union heavily fund arts programs to try to promote their images internationally. Now, at home, anything resembling communism becomes considered anti-American. And the Cold War is really in the United States characterized by a kind of black and white thinking. You're either with us or you're against us. The only thing that smacked of communism was seen as un-American. So, for example, Truman had proposed as part of his Fair Deal a national health insurance program, but this gets demonized as socialized medicine, and plays a big role in preventing it from getting passed. We also do other things like we add the phrase under God to the Pledge of Allegiance in order to counter what we believed was the godlessness of the communist system. Question number three, what major domestic policy initiatives did Truman undertake? So Truman was president and oversaw the demobilization of the armed forces after World War II, and millions of soldiers took advantage of the GI Bill upon their return, which granted them, of course, college tuition, low interest mortgage loans, and all the things that we talked about before. And as troops re-enter the workforce, it ends up displacing over 2 million women that had entered the workplace during World War II. During his administration, Truman is going to try to revive New Deal style policies with his own so called Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal called for things like increasing the minimum wage, instituting a national system of health insurance, expanding public housing, and expanding Social Security. But ultimately, much of this is not going to move forward because he faces a resistant Congress. Truman is also going to have to deal with a wave of post-war strikes. So as the wartime production ends, incomes, begin to drop. And out of fear of that, over five or about 5 million workers across the United States in a variety of fields go on strike, hoping to pressure management into maintaining wages where they had been during the war. Now, due to these post-war strikes and fatigue about Korea and just kind of general unpopularity of some of Truman's Fair Deal policies, the other party, the Republicans, will sweep into control of Congress in the 1946 midterm elections. And as a result, much of Truman's Fair Deal will stall. And even beyond that, Republicans are going to even have enough votes to pass some pieces of legislation over Truman's veto because they'll have big enough majorities that they can muster enough votes to override a veto. And the one here to know is the Taft-Hartley Act, which is passed in 1947 over Truman's veto. And because Republicans have long been suspicious of unions, believing them to be infiltrated by radical elements like communists, for example, the purpose of this law is to actually curb the power and influence of unions. It's going to ban forms of compulsory union membership, and interestingly, it's going to force union officials to swear that they were not communists. Now, Truman's first term in office is also going to see some advances for African Americans. We will see the NAACP launch massive voter registration drives in the South. Jackie Robinson will desegregate Major League Baseball in 1947 by joining the Brooklyn Dodgers. And politically, Truman is going to form a Commission on Civil Rights. And the Commission on Civil Rights is going to issue a report in 1947 called To Secure These Rights. And it made a variety of proposals to ensure civil rights for all Americans, including calling for the abolition of segregation, also calling for equal treatment in housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. And while Truman does take these proposals to Congress, ultimately none of them are approved. They face opposition from much of the Republican Party, And they also face opposition from within the Democratic Party, in particular Southern Democrats who take to calling themselves Dixiecrats and really distinguish themselves from the rest of the Democratic Party by being in opposition to equal rights for African Americans. However, as we've already said, Truman did take the remarkable step of issuing an executive order to desegregate the American military in 1948. So that is an advance that Truman's administration at least can point to. Truman will actually win re-election in 1948 in something of an upset. He was facing opposition from members of his own party, those Southern Dixiecrats who I mentioned, who opposed Truman's policies on civil rights. He also faced opposition from the Republican Party, of course. And then there was also this kind of short-lived left-wing party called the Progressive Party, not the same one as Teddy Roosevelt's from back in the Progressive era. But they were again, short-lived left-wing party that opposed Truman's foreign policy. So he's really facing opposition from three different groups, but manages to kind of barnstorm in the later days of the campaign and drum up enough support to win. And it's close enough that some newspapers even print that his opponent has won because they weren't really doing very good polling in the very last days of the election when Truman was starting to really pull ahead. Question number 4. What effects did the anti-communism of the Cold War have on American politics and culture? There's a lot of important stuff here. Dissent, ultimately, disagreement, being different, being nonconformist, those things came under attack during the Cold War, especially in the early days. And this oftentimes happened at the expense of American civil liberties. And again, we see this repeatedly in times of crisis or war, that the government is more likely to restrict civil rights and civil liberties. One example of this is that the government initiated a loyalty review program for federal workers to try to target suspected radicals in government and dismiss anyone who might have radical or communist ties. This was also a very useful tool for some in American politics to target homosexuals working in the federal government. Um, at the time, there was this odd association for some people that radical political thought was associated with sexual deviancy. So they're looking at homosexuality as a kind of sexual deviancy that, in their minds, is also connected to political radicalism. And there's also kind of a fear as well that the Soviets could use this as blackmail against federal workers and force them to be spies because they don't want it to come out that they're gay, uh, and they would, provide the Soviets with information in order to protect that. Um, this part of the Red, this, well, I don't want to call it the Red Scare because the Red Scare was the 1920s, but this is kind of a new Red Scare, this sort of anti-communist paranoia and hysteria after World War II is going to be confined really to the decade, or the most intense elements of it will be confined to the 1950s. But this targeting of homosexuals in the federal government is going to go from the 1940s into the 1960s. And historians called this the Lavender Scare. It results in a lot of dismissals and even more resignations because it's useful in putting people under a microscope and that will force them to resign in order to protect themselves. We also have the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, H-U-A-C. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated communism and different elements of American industry. In particular, they looked into Hollywood, believing that some Hollywood producers had communist ties and had been inserting communist propaganda subtly into their films. Now, the way to not get in trouble for this is to really, deny, 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 and then to name names, even if, you're accusing people that aren't guilty of anything. So some famous Hollywood types like Walt Disney and Ronald Reagan, future president, and at this time Hollywood actor, they named names and blamed other people to direct attention away from themselves. Others, like the Hollywood 10, tried to avoid, or rather tried to resist this by refusing to testify. And the Hollywood 10, along with any other Hollywood types who would not cooperate with this, tended to get blacklisted. A blacklist is a list that's like privately exchanged among employers, and it has the names of people that are supposed to be barred from employment or holding positions because of their radical political opinions. Now, keep in mind, even if any of these people had been associated with communism in some way, that is not a crime because that is your freedom of speech, your freedom of assembly. But in this era, that association with communism was a career ender and definitely was for a lot of people. Now, our fear of communist infiltration in the United States was not entirely unfounded. There were several high-profile spy trials in the 1950s. For example, we have here Alger Hiss, who passed atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. He will get caught for that, and the statute of limitations for treason or espionage will have expired by the time that he's caught, but they'll jail him for perjury for lying about it under oath. Probably important about this is that a young politician named Richard Nixon, depicted there on the left, will achieve national prominence for spearheading the investigation into Alger Hiss and his activities. And it's going to be a political winner for him enough that Dwight D. Eisenhower will pick him as his running mate in the upcoming election. We also have others. One, his name is Klaus Fuchs, Klaus, and then his last name is Fuchs. So I think it's Fuchs. But Klaus Fuchs also passed atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. He had worked at Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project for years. He had been present at the Trinity test, which is the first test of atomic weapons before we dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He knew about the development of the hydrogen bomb, and he even held a patent to one of the designs. Um, anyway, Klaus Fuchs is arrested for espionage, and this led to uncovering an alleged ring of spies, which included a couple that become kind of martyrs for the Cold War hysteria of the era. So this is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, found guilty, and ultimately executed. Um, and they were both Jewish and also low-ranking members of the Communist Party. So there is an element of scapegoating going on here in the same way as the Sacco and Vanzetti case in the 1920s. Um, the whether or not they were guilty is still subject to debate. The evidence against Julius was flimsy, but he probably did have some small role in passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Ethel, on the other hand, almost certainly had nothing to do with it. She was likely only accused in order to force a confession out of Julius, because the penalty for being found guilty was execution. So the Justice Department believed that if they effectively threatened to kill his wife, then he would confess to the crime, but he never did. And they were both executed in an atmosphere of paranoia. Finally, we have the infamous Senator Joseph McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy made sensational and false accusations of communism in order to gain political notoriety and to advance his political career. So much so that McCarthyism, named after him, comes to be a term that means making unfounded accusations of disloyalty. And really, McCarthyism is tantamount to a witch hunt. In fact, playwright Arthur Miller, his play The Crucible, even though it's about the Salem witch trials, is actually an allegory for McCarthyism. Um, Anyway, McCarthyism works by costing people their jobs, not by sending them to jail. So McCarthy would accuse people in the federal government, namely the State Department, of being infiltrated by communists, claiming to have lists of names, which he, of course, really did not have. And he used this kind of strategy of unfounded accusations of disloyalty and communism to go after civil rights groups, women's groups, alleged homosexuals, his own political rivals, and so on. Um, and there was ample fodder for him to do this, though. Uh, Here's the thing: the Soviet Union had tried for years to promote communism internationally through center left, kind of like left leaning political groups worldwide, even founding some in the US. These come to be known as front organizations. So there might be like a organization that forms for workers' rights or disaster relief, opposition to racism, opposition to fascism, and they might have names like American Youth for Democracy or World Federation of Scientific Workers, the League of American Writers. Um, they sound perfectly normal. They're fighting for what seem to be perfectly good causes. And tens of thousands of Americans over the years join organizations like this, which are actually front organizations for the Soviet Union. So, tens of thousands of Americans who were not communists found themselves guilty by association despite having tried to be on the right side of history. So, this allows McCarthy and his ilk to at least have some fodder or some grist for the mill when they're going after or making these types of accusations. McCarthy's downfall will ultimately come after he accused the army of communist infiltration, and that does not go over well. And really, by this point, so many people had been caught up in this McCarthyist net that many Americans found it harder to believe that so many of their neighbors were communist agents, and it increasingly looks like a witch hunt. So as more and more skeptics begin to push back, and then he goes after the army, which is not a popular move, he will lose the support of the public, ultimately be formally condemned by the Senate. But by this point, the damage is done. Lives and careers have been ruined, and the McCarthy hearings had added to a national atmosphere of anti-communist paranoia. McCarthy's not unique. We have a lot of local, small anti-communist organizations doing the same kind of work, targeting people and institutions for investigation, for blacklisting, and for censorship. In fact, anti-communism became a useful political tool for some to expand government power, to target political opponents, attack civil rights groups, attack unions, and oppose alleged radical groups like feminists and homosexuals. So again, we see this atmosphere of crisis, even though it is almost certainly overblown, contributing to violations of people's civil rights and civil liberties. And this kind of Cold War hysteria in the early days um, tends to feature more prominently, perhaps, than the military movements of the early days of the Cold War. So it would be worth focusing on this just as much as you do, say, the Marshall Plan or the Berlin Airlift or the Korean War.